Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are in Brussels, running the NEWAVE Synthesis Workshop on futures of water governance. And today we are extremely excited to be able to run a hybrid webinar with different speakers and discussants. And in the room, there is the group of NEWAVE researchers and scholars, while we have connections from abroad. So my name is Jampel Dell'Angelo. I'm an associate professor of water governance and politics, and I'm the principal investigator of NEWAVE. NEWAVE is an EU-funded innovative training network that finances 15 PhD students working on 15 different cases of water governance across the globe, and involves the participation of 30 organizations, academic, non-academic, from development, the private sector, the civil society, and I really invite you to look up our work on our blog and on our website. Today with us, we have Professor Lyla Mehta. She's a professor of development studies at the Institute of Development Studies. Welcome, Lyla. And on the same screen, I think from New York in this moment, if I'm correct, Henk Ovink, which all of you will know as, I think, the previous special envoy for international affairs for the Netherlands, and now he will update us on what is next on your agenda. And here in the room, Susanne Schmeier, who's the head of the Water Governance Department and associate professor of Water Law and Diplomacy at IHE Delft in the Netherlands. Together with me on my right, there is Dona Geagea. She's a researcher and a PhD researcher at the Institute for Environmental Studies. She's a NEWAVER, and she's working on municipalization in Mediterranean areas. While at my left, Radhika Singh, she is an ESR and a PhD researcher at the University of Nairobi, working on the politics of rainwater harvesting. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Radhika to take the floor and provide a brief overview of the Water Action Agenda.
Great, thank you so much, Jampel, and very excited to be over here and be talking to such a diverse group of panelists on the Water Action Agenda. So before I dive into some of the specific aspects of the Water Action Agenda, I thought it would be helpful to first provide a brief overview of what exactly the Water Action Agenda is. And yeah, hopefully that will provide some grounding. So the Water Action Agenda is a set of voluntary pledges to contribute to the Water Action Decade, which was from 2018 and is intended to end in 2028. And these pledges are from a variety of different sectors and industries. And the idea is that it will help make water governance, global water governance, a more coordinated effort and a little bit less fragmented, and also attach those efforts to more clear and tangible goals and outcomes. So I'll be talking a little bit over the next couple of minutes about some of the framing, goals, and mechanisms embedded in the Water Action Agenda that have received attention after the UN Water Conference, and in some cases, some criticisms. And this would be really an opportunity to hear from our panelists on their perceptions of the Water Action Agenda, what aspects of it they feel can be improved, and yeah, whether and what they see are the opportunities and limitations of the Water Action Agenda moving forward. And before I dive into this, I'd like to also preface this by saying that some of the critiques that I'm going to bring up are not necessarily leveled at any particular institution in particular, and have mostly just arisen from a lot of the conversations that we've been having as NEWAVE in the network, and also some of the conversations we've been engaging with globally, online, and this sort of thing. So it would be very interesting for us to hear how you respond, whether you think these critiques can be more nuanced, and yeah, just how you would feel moving forward. So the first thing that I'd want to bring up is the framing of the water crisis and how this is displayed in the Water Action Agenda. So the Water Action Agenda is aimed at tackling this widening gap between demand and the sustainable supply of water globally. And of course, this involves finding a balance between sustainable development on one hand of the water resources, and on the other hand, a respect for planetary boundaries. In the conversations of this framing, water has been perceived as a global commons. And there has been some critiques about this framing being a little bit misplaced because there's this articulation that water isn't necessarily a global common. It's actually much better understood as a local common where it is managed or mismanaged. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about the benefits or downsides of this articulation of water as a global commons, what it can contribute to the water agenda, or what it might take away from it. The second aspect that I want to bring up are issues of collective action. So some of the biggest issues and critiques that were brought up around the agenda was the fact that all of these commitments, these hundreds of commitments that were brought together are all voluntary. And to give a little bit more context, over half of these commitments came from NGOs, while only around 26% came from governments. Moreover, less than 1/5 of these commitments target the agriculture and industrial sectors, and those are, of course, the biggest consumers of water. So I think something that has been in a lot of conversations around this agenda is that it's just not very clear who will lead this collective action around solving global water problems and how this leadership will take place. Moreover, some of the commitments were also criticized for the fact that it seemed like a lot of the priority setting was being done by actors of the global north, not the global south. So I guess the question over here that arises is, how useful exactly is the water action agenda for mobilizing collective action? Or does it just, mimic the current fragmentation that we already see in the global water sector? The next thing that I want to talk to, which is linked to this issue of collective action, is of course accountability. And the big question over here is, if these commitments are not legally binding, how on earth are we going to hold actors accountable to their commitments? Only 22% of the commitments as of March included quantitative targets for their outcomes. This makes it extremely difficult if there are no quantitative outcomes. Of course, there are some issues with this, but if there are no quantitative outcomes in the majority of the commitments, how are we supposed to evaluate project successes or failures? And even internally, how are the implementers supposed to evaluate how well they're doing? And so I guess the issue over here then is talking about how can commitments in the water action agenda be better articulated so they do yield to tangible outcomes, real change, and that actors are held to account. Then the last thing that I want to bring up is financing. And this is something that has really been a big discussion point within NEWAVE. And I'll start by saying that only 28% of commitments, again, as of March, have identified a clear source of funding for their, the goals that they intend to carry out. And it really does seem that commitments are a little bit meaningless if you don't have a clear source of financing behind them. So following from that is the question of, when we are talking about financing, how do we think about whether to leverage private sector involvement, public sector involvement, some sort of combination of the two? Are there other sources of funding that we need to be thinking about more seriously? And just related to this topic of the privatization, of water resources and water resource management, there has been criticism on one hand that with this push for privatization, there's a real danger in ignoring the need for increased public financing. But on the other hand, it has also been articulated that lower income countries with minimal resources, minimal public resources, may often struggle to increase public funding. And if so, that often just means increasing their debt. And that debt is often to countries of the global north. So, I mean, these are all such big complex questions, but how can we, even begin to have some tools to navigate these complex questions when trying to understand the role of financial commitments being made in the pledges as part of the water action agenda? So I'll stop over here. I mean, I think just to try to wrap up, it's generally agreed that the UN Water Action Agenda has come at an essential time. It has been effective in highlighting several key issues, and it did result in a lot of collaboration, exchanges, and rich communications across actors internationally. But so it would be wonderful if the panelists, after hearing some of these issues that have been brought up around framing, collective action and accountability, and around financing, could talk about whether they perceive some opportunities and limitations as part of the water action agenda, and any recommendations they could make for making the agenda a more effective instrument in water governance. Thank you.
So the idea here would be that the questions of Radhika will be answered by all the three panelists, and so I would actually like to invite Professor Mehta to start first.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I've heard a lot about NEWAVE, and it seems like you're doing great work, and it's great to be on this panel also with Henk, Ovink, and others. So I must start by saying, you know, it was great to be at the UN Water Conference. It was great that there was such a conference, because we waited 46 years for such a conference. The last one was in the late 70s, and of course the world has changed. We know that there are really, really compelling challenges around water, around sanitation, around governance. So in that respect, it was great to be there. There were 7,000 people there from all over. Of course, there could have been more participation from the global south. There were issues around voices and who was actually there and who was not there. And there was huge expectations because we hadn't had a conference. Unlike food and climate, we don't have regular conferences in the water domain. I agree a lot with a lot of the things that Radhika said. Now, when I read the water action agenda before the conference, it seemed really vague and fuzzy. You know, it was all, it wasn't very incisive. And I think that kind of feeling carried on through the conference. As you say, you know, they ended up with about over 800 of these voluntary pledges from all kinds of groups, NGOs, and everybody. And the Water Resources Institute analyzed several of these commitments, and only a quarter of them actually were potential game changers, whatever that means. And you also have to ask, you know, whose game are we talking about and what are we interested in terms of targets, in terms of cross-border action, etc. So really fuzzy. And, you know, who is to take forward this agenda? And I think that was a frustration before, and that was also a frustration at the end of the meeting. So I think I agree with you in the sense that it's great to have all this commitment and excitement and buzz and all these different NGOs and others putting forward their commitments, but without actual targets, without any mechanism for accountability, for tracking, it's not really going to go anywhere. And indeed, there was this open letter from a whole bunch of NGOs that actually really critiqued some of this and really critiqued the conference for its lack of teeth, for its lack of ambition, for its lack of commitment, and really highlighting the fact that we really weren't taking the risks to what this actually means, you know, billions without water and sanitation, the linkages with climate, with food, etc., and, you know, daily violations in terms of human rights to water and sanitation. Now, in terms of collective action and accountability, which is what you asked, yes, I agree. You know, there's a critical issue there. Around the framing, yes, you know, it is good to raise this urgency around the crisis, but obviously the apocalyptic framing can also detract from issues that you guys are probably interested in around power, around politics, around scale, around the lack of transparency, fragmented governance systems, around the fact that we're talking about exclusions of some of the most poorest and marginalized people who lack a voice. And these voices were not really represented at the conference. So I think there is a serious problem around, and you know, just blaming everything on climate change and talking about the climate emergency can also naturalize poor management systems, poor governance systems, and lack of commitment, lack of financing, etc. I agree also about the global stuff. To talk about a global common is compelling, but water is largely a local and a regional issue. Though there have been apparently this new research, or the new report did talk a lot about the global dimension. I'm skeptical. I'm quite skeptical about looking at the global water cycle as a global common good, where the clouds, you know, somewhere over the Amazon, and where the rain there, or cutting trees in one place will affect clouds elsewhere. I think the science is open on that. There's a lot of uncertainty around these debates, but it sounds compelling, especially around the new research, or, you know, this, you know, the planetary boundaries is done by the rock stars. It's compelling. Everybody listens to it. I'm skeptical because I think we really need to look at local, regional, and diverse scales and how these play out, and then the unevenness of this process. So it's kind of sexy to talk about everything at the global level, but actually the problem is really at the local and the regional level. And finally, your challenge around the financing. It was telling for me, the Dutch organized, we have to have a little word conversation about the role of the Dutch, but maybe we'll do that later. And it's absolutely great that Henk is here, because it'd be great to hear more from him. But there were so many panels there where we heard, and everywhere we talk about the private sector, the importance of the private sector. The World Economic Forum was there wrapping up the meeting. That's great. But, there's so much that is missing in terms of public financing, in terms of taxation, in terms of how we're talking about valuing water. So I think there were lots of missing dimensions. Of course, we need all actors. We need finance from everywhere. But don't forget what the private sector has done so far and has failed to do. And the fact that you often need strong public commitment, especially for the poorest and the most vulnerable, those who are in off-grid settings, where you can't make a profit. And I think there are limits to what Coke, Nestle, Danone, or whoever can do. And, we really need to then think about the aid architecture, the states, and, everywhere across Europe, governments, including where I sit in the UK, have slashed their aid budgets. I'm not saying that this is the solution, but it has to be collective and really a strong impetus around public financing and public commitment, and not to tolerate these daily violations. And for that, you really need new action. But I think I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Professor Mehta. So I would like now to pass it to Henk Ovink. And I also would like to anticipate that the next discussant will actually address directly the issue of the UN Water Conference. So here we're really interested in having this initial conversation focusing on the water action agenda. And with this, I would like to pass it to you, Henk.
Thank you all. It's great to be with you online, and thanks all for your the start of the conversation. I think I'm not different than many others, as challenged as you all are by a couple of things. But I also want to bring this to a larger perspective than only the water action agenda. Because in 2018, the General Assembly tried to agree on a resolution to get to a midterm review of the water action decade. And they managed, but against all odds, and with a very limited and very contested scope and process. If we were among ourselves, I would say very messy. I was there. And friends in the water space really did not give each other a lot of light there. So 2020, we had another opportunity when the modalities of the conference were negotiated. And I sketch this because for better or for worse, we have the United Nations as the platform where we try to bring this together. And the outcome of that modalities resolution can be judged in many, many different ways. I think knowing that we have nothing on water, there is no agreement or treaty or compact or whatsoever, there's a couple of ways to look at it. From an urgency perspective, it's a disaster. Billions of people lack access to water, to hygiene facilities and sanitation facilities. Extremes are only becoming more extreme. Places that are most vulnerable with people that are in vulnerable conditions are hit hardest every day, hour. So it's when I talk about this, I always want to use less diplomatic words, but it's a shame, literally, that this is the current situation. But that is also true. I don't know if you are part of the Bonn dialogues, not right, that happening in preparation of the COP. Everything is a mess. So water is alas no different. But we agreed on a modalities resolution when you look at the scope, that was not expected. So from 2016 to 2018, there was progress, but not a lot. But from 2018 to 2020, there was a lot of progress. At the same time, the modalities resolution also emphasized the fact that there is no agreement on water. So the outcome of this conference could only be a summary of the proceedings and voluntary commitments. Now, if you disagree with the fact that there should be voluntary commitments, then this is the origin of that. The modalities resolution set us on a track to fragmentation of voluntary commitments. So a year later, in the fall of 2021, when for the first time we brought the membership together, the Netherlands and Tajikistan, to talk about the conference, I said in the call, I think this is not enough. A bunch of voluntary commitments, like a postmodernistic flower garden, bloom for a season or not, nobody knows. So I said, we have to bring them together in a global pact for water. That scared the hell out of everybody, because before you know it, a pact is a legally binding document and we don't have a negotiated process. The conference had no mandate for a negotiated process. There was no agreement. So pact, a global pact for water, went nowhere. But it informed the discussion that commitments alone are not enough, because then nobody knows. So out of that conversation, from commitments 1 to 1,000 versus a pact, came this idea to at least structure them in an agenda so we could track them. At least have an opportunity to build a system that is where there was no mandate for that still. So we pitched the water action agenda. That I think that is one. I'll get back to this. The second is the conference itself is a cover-up that we don't agree on water. So we worked 2 years for a conference, but not on water. We worked on a conference. So don't think that because there is a conference, all of a sudden we agree on water. We totally disagree on water. Everybody disagrees on what water is. So the conference itself was a showcase of commitment that water is important, but not a showcase of agreement and alignment. And because there is no negotiation towards the conference and after, and because there's no process, it felt like a wow, but it was a wow on the importance, yes, and on the commitment, yes, but not on the alignment and agreement. And we were not able to surface that, table that non-alignment and non-agreement, because there's no negotiation. When there is a conference without a negotiation, you don't have a negotiation. And to that, we had in the preparatory work, and according to the mandate of the conference, we could identify 5 interactive dialogues, not more, not less, and address themes. And we try to address water in its broadest sense, looking at the human rights and water and sanitation and hygiene and availability and health, looking at all these nexuses between water, economic, but also from cities and slums and energy and food and agriculture and subsidies, looking at water and disasters and climate and biodiversity and the environment, looking at water and partnerships and informal and formal and accountability and transparency and public and private and indigenous and not, and looking at the follow-up, 5 themes. And the closing of the conference was when the 10 co-chairs on the 5 interactive dialogues reported back. And I think that is a moment underestimated thus far, also because the summary of the conference really doesn't help. But the closing of the conference with the 5 interactive dialogues reporting back, nobody did something with that yet. And I challenged myself and the world to pick this up. I put it all together in one document, but still it's not a readable thing. I need to work on it, and others perhaps are inspired to do the same. But if you put all the messaging coming out of the dialogues and what the co-chair said at the closing of the conference, and even if you add Secretary General's comments and the PGA, but let's keep it to the 5 that was a showcase of addressing water in its most comprehensive way at the UN. That was never before, and this was the mandate of the conference. That is not an agreed upon language then all of a sudden, but at least it can lead to something that we could agree on. So I think that parallel to the fact that it's about voluntary commitment, it was also about what is water now, 46 years after Mar del Plata. So how do we talk on water? What is the context of a UN systems approach to water, and what is needed for it? So I think that's an important part that has been totally not addressed, and is going to be of critical importance to capture if we want to move water forward in the context of the UN. And then 2 more things on the agenda. I'll get to the agenda, but the fact that the conference was a moment, Saturday morning. Well, I had a side event on Saturday, but most of you had no side events on Saturday. And like before the conference, there was still nobody to call. There was no follow-up process, nor organizational capacity. And as of this week, and it's 12 weeks after the closing of the conference, only now do we know that there is at least political commitment for a follow-up in the context of a resolution that will be tabled in the GA, where there will be some messaging on a follow-up. So, and I remember my conversation with Secretary General Guterres the day before the opening of the conference. This is going to be so granular, because if you have nothing, a revolution is not going to happen out of nothing. It's just not there. So there is definitely hope, because there is a granular process in the making. But are we close? No. This is, for me, all important in the context of the Water Action Agenda, because the agenda itself is not salvation at all, not even close. But it's at least something to build off on. And I couldn't agree more. At least now, we agreed that every year at the HLPF, an assessment of the voluntary commitments will be presented to the world. And that is not accountability, but that is at least a way to get that organized. Voluntary commitments by themselves are exactly what they are. And an NDC in a way is also a voluntary commitment, but at least it has a Paris agreement and a follow-up process. Here, there is no agreement and no agreed upon follow-up process. So I would almost ask you not to judge the commitment because there is no agreement. I would ask you to judge the world that there is no agreement on water and no follow-up process. The commitment itself can't be blamed by the fact there is no environment to have that follow-up. I'm actually I was surprised that the World Resource Institute said that 28% have the capacity to really deliver. I think that is from the fact that there is like no commitment, no follow-up, no agreement, no alignment, quite a lot. And I'm not saying this is amazing. I'm just saying that it is so vulnerable what we created. We have to treat it from that perspective. And second, financing. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But here also funding from a global perspective will not bring salvation. Neither will interference of private sector all of a sudden work. I think the water action agenda can help continue to push the conversation towards beyond fragmentation to a more holistic, comprehensive and inclusive approach, where we will need the follow-up of this conference definitely to build this. I don't know what the solutions are here, but I'm more and more convinced that without a global arrangement of having a negotiation, to be forced to talk about our differences, to really understand where we disagree, is necessary to be able to overcome that. And I also know this is going to be so contested because we truly disagree on the role of the UN, countries, NGOs, private sector, and regional approaches. I do hope that with the organization of the follow-up of the Water Action Agenda, we can build an accountability mechanism per commitment and as an agenda, and at least how we try to do it now towards the HLPF. But the HLPF, this is proof of the pudding is in the eating. We will see how that goes as a first step. We never did this as a world, so we have to see how this will work. And if in the ones that have the funding and the ones that are delivering, we can identify follow-up mechanisms to connect it to other sources of funding and see scaling and replication there. But so this is a way too long response to everything you said. I'm very sorry, but if I were to just answer to your 3 points on fragmentation, accountability, and financing, I would say, yes, you are totally right. But in the context of the complexity, I'm not sure if it's really about wrong or right. I really think there is an opportunity still, but it is as vulnerable as it was before the conference, perhaps even more vulnerable now, because among some in the world, there is this idea that we agree and we don't. And there is no mechanism in place for that agreement and disagreement to get organized on the scale of the world. So in that sense, we're only left by our own commitment because there is no mandated opportunity to do anything else. So the hope is now on the follow-up process of the resolution.
Thanks a lot, Henk. So now I would like to pass it to Professor Schmeier, and you can build up on the questions of Radhika and the previous panelists.
Yeah, thanks. Henk, you covered some of the things that I wanted to say, because I was also thinking, if we ask ourselves, what is that water action agenda and how useful or effective it's going to be? I think the question that needs to come before is what would have been possible? What was possible in the first place? And I think the background that you gave, Henk, was very helpful, because I think the whole thing is limited from the very beginning, but somehow there was maybe also not a very good expectation management. So I think the expectations that a lot of people, communities, or representatives of different sectoral organizations had did not match with what was possible from the beginning. Not only because of sort of the background that Henk gave in terms of decision-making at the UN level with all the member states, but I think also for a number of other reasons. One being that water is very different from other global issues. Like a lot of people were saying, oh, we need in New York, we need a Paris moment for water, like the New York moment for what we had in Paris. But then the climate challenge is quite different from the water challenge. It's much more complex. There are many more challenges. It's much more multi-level. As was said before, it's also very localized. So having the expectation that a global conference would actually solve a lot of these things, I think was also a bit of a wrong expectation. And then I think the third thing I would say is maybe that expectation that you can solve water issues with a water conference or with a water action agenda. I would rather think we need a beyond the water agenda or all the other sectors that use water agenda, because what happens to water is not what the water sector decides. And we know that in many countries, the Ministry of Water is really the one that's definitely not calling the shots, but it's other ministries. And even if you look at the SDGs, right, the amount or the way we need, the way a lot of people think we need to use water in order to achieve, for example, zero hunger or clean energy, is just incompatible with SDG 6. And I think for these reasons, there was, for me, a huge mismatch in the expectations towards the conference and the water action agenda and what was actually feasible. On the positive side, though, I would say that there was momentum created, and I think the water action agenda is a starting point, but I would see it as the beginning of something and not the conference as the end of something. And I think it was quite positive to see how many different actors came together, different also in terms of sectors and backgrounds. Yes, and it was mentioned before, there was an issue with representation, but I guess it's the glass half full, half empty question. If you look at old pictures from the 1977 conference, we've come a long way in terms of diversity on all ends, right? So from that perspective, I think, yeah, more could have been done, but it was a good step already. And also the fact that it was, that there were commitments from so many other actors than state actors, I think is promising. On the other hand, if you look at the other side of that coin, is that maybe also diverting a little bit of the attention away from the fact that there was so few government commitments, public funding and financing was mentioned earlier. Yes, that's the key for how the water sector should be funded and how the implementation of these commitments should be funded, but it's often not happening. And yes, for one reason, probably because a lot of countries struggle financially, but I very strongly believe that that's not the only reason. It's a question of prioritization. And if, as a government, you do not value investments in water, be that WASH or be that water resources management or transboundary water management, which is even more difficult to grasp, then you're not going to put the financial resources in there, even if you have them. So I think that is sort of something else to keep in mind. Maybe we can discuss about that later. But yeah, for me, so the question, and I'll end there because I think it would be nice to have a discussion with the room. For me, the question is really what was possible. And I think based on what was possible, I was surprised to see that many commitments. I totally agree with you that some of them are, well, either not very specific, or they don't have funding, or they're not quantified and not measurable. And I would also add that some of them are so hyper-localized that they're actually not commitments that necessarily belong to a global conference. Like there were commitments, just look at these 829 or whatever it is now, about, was somewhere in India, but I think there were others as well, about so many school children planting so many trees to fight erosion, which is of course great and should be done. But is that something that should be a commitment at a global level? Is that something that will transform the way we look at water, we manage water? I don't know. So I think, yes, there are flaws in the commitments, but it is a step forward, or like a momentum that we have created that wasn't there before. But now, as Henk was saying, that was 3 months after the conference. Are we making something out of that momentum? I don't know.
Thanks a lot. So what I'm hearing here is that there is an agreement on the fact that we all agree to disagree, and that we all agree that water is important. But I wonder if these two broad agreements have a depoliticizing type of nature. And I think that as NEWAVE, we went to the UN Water Conference as an accredited organization. We actually organized two online panels, and 12 of us were there, and we were fully involved and excited to be part of shaping the revision of the water action agenda. And I think that in that sense, we did come up with some shared concerns. And so here, perhaps it's a good moment for Dona Geagea to share her thoughts about the UN Water Conference.
Sure, yes. Maybe I'll bring this closer. And thank you, Jampel, for capturing a little bit of what was just discussed. And I feel like some of it already touched a little bit on the conference, because of course the two are linked. And so what I wanted to do was to take a little bit of a different approach to this and go very personal. So as a participant myself at the UN Water Conference, as somebody who is researching water governance, as someone who has worked in the water sector for some years, has been to World Water Forums in South Korea, in Brazil, somebody who has attended also multiple international water weeks and national water weeks, I think also I agree in that there was this sort of anticipation. What would be different about this UN Water Conference? And so absolutely, I mean, the credit goes to the fact that it's about building momentum, and it was able to demonstrate that by mobilizing, I believe it was around 7,000 people participating in this conference. And of course, as Henk also clarified, the intention was actually, you know, the UN procedure, which I came to understand there, is that the member states would come and read their commitments. And so the added participatory aspect of it was sort of a tag-on to the conference to enable this momentum building and take advantage of this opportunity. So absolutely an important task, very important, of course, we would all agree, for all of us involved in water governance or studying water in any way, after, you know, almost 45 years, and setting water as a priority on the global agenda. From a personal perspective, I think what for me was a bit challenging, and I do agree, it's about the expectation setting component, is I walked away and I talk about it as having the same taste in my mouth as I did from walking out of a World Water Forum. I felt that certainly there was this representation, there were these events and rooms where different types of dialogue about different topics and thematically around water was happening. But the biggest challenge was arriving to these very small enclosed spaces where a panel was set up. You heard at times very conflicting perspectives, and I'll speak to that in a moment to make it less abstract. And there was no room for a debate or for a deeper engagement with hearing what people who arrived to this long process to share, or reflections, or even questioning some of the ideas that were put forward. And so for me, it's really about when mobilizing at such a global platform, paying attention to some of the, of course, maybe unintended consequences or risks that come with this. And so it's very much about the power dynamics that exist and that continue to perhaps replicate themselves in such spaces, when maybe the hope was that this would be the space to maybe diffuse some of those power dynamics. So one particular example, and I just wanted to ground it in something very specific, I sat in on a panel with a multinational corporation speaking about collective action and water stewardship. And I'm conducting research, looking at social movements, working collective action. And the understanding of collective action comes from a very different lens. So I sat there, and what I heard was really alarming for me, because it was about reducing collective action and water stewardship to initiatives for hand washing, so that employees, that it would reduce absenteeism of employees, and, you know, focusing on the health aspect of that, and tree planting. And I mean, I'm sharing this because it was certainly something I was not expected to hear, that collective action and water stewardship would be reduced to that. And I understand these are considered important initiatives and perhaps, you know, something that's being done. But just to problematize the co-optation of certain language and vocabulary that perhaps is used differently in other spaces in the water system by other actors. And the other one is that the issue around voices at the heart of water governance. So absolutely, this time it was great to see a lot more women representing, also indigenous women who continue to sound alarm bells. But these were happening also on the sidelines in these rooms. And so I was wondering, isn't it time that these become center stage? So perhaps a question for reflection after is, how can these become more center stage? Also, a particular paradigm was being pushed forward. I think, for me, that became pretty evident. So when I say the same taste in my mouth is, of course, there's a certain degree of representation of market-based solutions as the best approach to tackling, from a technical lens, but also, from an economic lens, financializing water. And what I was missing was there were a lot of conversations about other paradigms. Of course, nature-based solutions is a popular one now, but I'm talking about also, other ones that perhaps focus a lot more on the plurality of ways of tackling water challenges, both at a local and global level. And I was missing a little bit of that because certain views were definitely dominating. I'll give another example in another panel where they were presenting a public consultation model that was supposed to be innovative and novel. And there was an indigenous leader, a woman who was who said, if our communities would be consulted, we would say no to this development project happening or extraction project happening. But they continued to present this participatory model. And there was no dialogue there around this very important point that was represented. So without going on much further on this, I'm speaking a bit maybe about like the micropolitics in the rooms, but also about the risks when we mobilize such a large group of people at such a high level panel and space platform. What happens when we continue to replicate the same paradigms and the same power dynamics? What I really appreciated, yes, seeing more women in leadership. And as I mentioned, some were still operating also in a particular paradigm. I'll give an example. Kenya committed to building 100 dams in the next 5 years. There's a paradigm of controlling water. And of course, I mean, we cannot control what every state is going to commit, but it was just what I heard and what I was seeing. Finally, I was left with the question of, yeah, I think it was also said before, who is doing water governance? Who is still left out? Which paradigms are being more visibly or blatantly pushed forward while others are being resisted? And of course, the final question leaving was, is the UN platform the right, with considering its institutional constraints, the right body to be leveraging this type of mobilization? The rhetoric at the end was very much that we need to be game changers, and I heard it quite a few times, but in the end, we always end up with the same results, which is falling behind on our goals. And so with that, I'll put forward the question, because I think now it's important to direct our attention to moving forward. What can we take from all of this? What's coming next? What should we expect? And what role can we play, perhaps especially as young researchers in the water governance sphere around this? And my question particularly is, what are perhaps for each of you 2 to 3 key critiques that we should focus on and learn from moving forward, and what actionable steps can actors take to leverage these learnings?
Thank you, Dona. So perhaps changing the order, I would like to start from you, Susanne.
Okay. Where do I start? And only 2 to 3. I think one key question that you alluded to, and links a bit back to what I said earlier about expectations, is yes, we can and should question whether the UN and such a big conference in New York is the way to go. But for me, the question is also, what is the alternative, right? And I think there is not a lot of thinking being put into this. And I think there are a lot of questions behind that the global water world, but also maybe you as researchers should think about, right? If we continue, and there are good reasons for doing so, I guess, to govern our international relations, our multilateral systems through organizations such as the UN, then of course the UN is the platform to have such conferences. And that is also what we do with other issue areas, right? More or less linked to the UN, but having global platform for biodiversity, climate change, and so on. If we think, and also maybe to add to that, this is also where intergovernmental processes happen. So if we believe that to a large extent, water questions should be dealt with at the global intergovernmental agenda, then the UN is probably the place to be. Yes, there are questions around, can we improve the UN? Yes, we all know inefficiencies, we all know the issues around UN water, but then the way forward would be to improve that platform. If, however, we think water is different from climate change, for example, to stick with that really global problem, and it has to be dealt with differently depending on context at the local level, national level, and the basin level, then the subsidiarity principle would probably kick in, and we would probably need to think about maybe the basin level and maybe make basin organizations the place to be. Clearly, they're not prepared for that in many basins, and you can wonder whether that would be efficient in the future, but that would be a different avenue. Or whether we say, and I know a lot of people in the water world would also be arguing that, no, water is so local and context specific and belongs in the hands of local people, local knowledge, traditional knowledge, then we are at the very local level. And that, I think, is a choice, and I might have a tendency there, but I'm not going to say that. But I think for me, that's really a question that needs to be tackled and where research should be done, but also where policy discussions should be held. Because I think now we're mixing things of, yes, the default option is we make a big international conference, but then we critique it for not bringing all these local, I'm exaggerating now, all these local people. But yeah, could we have brought all of them to New York? Who would have paid for that? Would that be the solution? Would the outcomes have been any different if there had been 200 more indigenous women? And obviously I'm being polemic here. So for me, that is one of the key questions that I think we need to think about moving forward. The other point, and it came through a little bit earlier already, is also how do we move forward beyond water? Really acknowledging, and that for me is really close to my heart, acknowledging that in fact all the vast majority of the decisions that are being taken that affect water, the way we use water, the way we save water, we don't save water, the way we deal with water in the public and the private sector, and so on, actually happen outside of the water sector. They happen in Ministry of Agriculture, obviously energy planning, investment, finance. They happen in the private sector, in companies within and beyond the water sector. And obviously we have not been very successful in bringing those in, or even maybe alerting them to the fact that whatever they, really all of us, in fact also, are doing has implications on water. So that, for me, I also don't know how to do that, right? Because we just make the problem so big and so complex that I don't know how that would practically work like. Like if we say we have a follow-up conference in 5 years or 10 years, what would we do differently in terms of bringing all those that affect water together? I don't know, but that would bring for me also be a question, maybe at least one, if not more, PhD theses are needed on. And then I had one other point that I think I've got right now, but I can come back to it later.
Thank you, Susanne. So following on the left of Susanne, perhaps Henk, you would like to comment on Dona's comments?
Yes, of course. And again, and that's a little bit also what, well, I don't want to put words in the mouth of anyone, but what Susanne tried to say as well. The conference is not well, I hope, let's say that the conference is not going to be the last attempt, but it definitely was not good on all scales. There also was not an illusion, I think, that out of nothing we could create, paradise. if we look, yeah, I don't know if you said it or before the 1.5. I don't know if you know how long it took to get to Paris. Organized with agreements coming from Kyoto, Bali, failed Copenhagen. And I know we don't have the time for that because the world is falling apart and we should be angry and I'm frustrated and angry and all that. But knowing that, you can't expect a UN Water Conference to all of a sudden skip 46 years and then, tick all the boxes. Now, I'm not saying you should not ask this. So it's not a saying that you're not right. I think you're totally right. I also say, we could question, did we do enough? I think that is it's a good question, and you should not ask me because I'm the subject of that question. So I dare not to answer that. I'm pretty sure at least we tried. I can tell you with honesty that I tried everything I could. I'd like to share a story for that, how complex it is on a very mini scale. It was in the middle of the conference, and I think it was Wednesday to Thursday. It was very dense. There was a lot happening. No sleep, and I got 50 emails by. So my email box was flooded by a group of indigenous peoples that brought together a statement that they wanted to voice, but of course they were too late. The UN has a very rigorous process. I can't even tell on how that would work. And then, you also know, because we had so many member states, other partners are always end of the line. These are the rules of the UN. You could question them, and we try to. But based on these emails, I worked with the group, and I really said, okay, but we can use the interactive dialogues because they are a formal platform to bring that voice in. But they said, no, we want to be in the GA, in the general debate. And I really had a total emotional outbreak with one of the representatives because I was as frustrated as them that it did not work. So I saw my strohalm, I don't know how to say that, my straw to hold on to were the interactive dialogues, because that was the one I could influence, working with the co-chairs to give them a formal place and a voice, being then also part of the reporting back. And Patricia Martin Diaz, she was a spokesperson and advocate for Spanish for the group. She said, no way. So we had it was not a fight, but in a showcase of total frustration. And we changed the conversation. I said, okay, let's start again. And then thanks to the dear colleagues at UNDESA, on Thursday, we were able to give them the floor. I'm not saying this is a success, but this is like on the mini scale, how tough it is in the context of a process that is indeed organized through a UN system that has rules of engagement to be flexible and adaptive. And I can tell you, everyone at UNDESA did everything to bend the rules to the law. We had 200 side events in 3 days. The Ocean Conference had 155. We pushed and squeezed everything out of it. Is it enough? No, I mean, of course not. Because the world shows it's not enough. It's falling apart. We have wildfires in Canada, floods all over the world, wars and disaster. We're spending our development aid to the weapon industry and the fossil industry, which is of course not the case. This should all not be happening, but it's happening. 99% of our global investment goes to stupidity instead of to smart stuff. So it's not okay. So you're right. Is it therefore a failure? I don't know. And then to Susanne's point on is it local, river basin, regional, or global? It's everything, of course. We really pushed the global water cycle over the balance. So there is no way we can't address water at the global scale. We must. Waters from Latin America impact Africa and the other way around. It is a global issue. It has to be dealt with at the global scale. And it's going to be tough. But we have to find a way to support the conversation of disagreement and agreement, because I actually disagree with the sentence. I think you said it, agree to disagree. We don't agree to disagree. We don't even have the conversation for that. We have to organize our disagreement in a transparent way to be able to find opportunity to bridge that disagreement and get to agreement and alignment. But this conference did not have that mandate. And if we dare, we could. I'm not sure if there is actually the courage in the world to do so. But I'm in. Count me in if we are able to get that. Because I think that conversation across scales and interest exactly on where we disagree in full transparency has to be organized.
Thanks a lot, Henk. So I think Susan wanted to just add something before I pass it to Lyla.
I just wanted to, the third thing that I wanted to say just came back to my mind, and I think I just want to mention it because it's a more positive note. What I think really the conference brought out, although it made things more complicated, is that it really for the first time brought in sort of new issues or topics that were so far niche issues that the world, the water community, and also beyond have to deal with. And I'll give you one example. Ecocide, especially in the water context, and the effects of armed conflict, of war on water, and how especially international criminal law could deal with that, was always a bit of a niche topic. There were maybe 2-3 international water lawyers who were talking about how can we include this in the Rome Statute of the ICC, for example. And then I heard this at various events there, and I had the feeling that a lot of people who had never really thought about it, you know, it was brought to their attention. And now with the latest developments in Ukraine, I think we clearly see how important that is. So I think that is something the conference really contributed, putting things on the agenda for a broader audience.
Thanks. So Lyla, passing it to you.
Oh, thank you. Lyla, by the way, not Lyla.
Lyla, sorry, my Italian is taking over.
No worries. Really, really good points raised by the two panelists. So, and thanks for the provocation also. So I think I would say, yes, I prefer to be hosted at the UN rather than by a French or a Swedish NGO. So it's much better than a World Water Week or a World Water Forum, where you have to pay, you know, a lot of fees to get in. And it's also, you know, here at least it was the world, you were there, you know, and of course, as I said, there were issues about representation, but still there was a certain buzz because it was at a UN conference. So I think that was great. So I really like that. And as you said, and both, as the panelists have said, both of you, you know, some of the side events were amazing. So I think the real buzz, the real excitement was in the side events where really, and what was also good, unlike a Stockholm conference or unlike a World Water Forum meet, is that there were different actors that got together, proposed their panels. It was very competitive. And thank you, Henk, for including so many. That was great. So it's very difficult to know where to go, actually. But there were really, you know, different actors collaborating to have their panels. So you really had really interesting things about interlinkages of rights, sort of water, food, nutrition, Palestinian rights. So there were really some exciting things there. So I really enjoyed that buzz. Now, in terms of my criticism, and while I agree that it was really interesting to hear about the possible limitations ahead and, in advance, and that's why we shouldn't expect too much, I do have some fundamental questions about the place of water in the UN. For children, you have UNICEF. For climate, you have UNFCCC. UNDP is development, but then water is UN water. What does UN water do? And I think now there's a thing about revamping UN water, but water lacks a champion in the UN system. And then that's why I hope you're not going, Henk, because I did want to find out, in some ways, this was hosted 2 days. It was a 3-day event as opposed to a 2-week event, like in the COP. And it was, championed by you, the Dutch, and Tajikistan. I want to know, how is it that these 2 countries ended up doing it, rather than, actually having a big organization doing it. And I know it ended up being, your passion was clearly there. But look at the difference between this event and, let's say, what is done every year in the World Committee for Food Security, where you have multi-stakeholder dialogues, you have reports. And I'm not saying we need and climate, of course, climate is contested and we're still taking a long time to get there, but there are annual meetings and we can at least say, the world is united on some kind of targets. We don't have that equivalent in water. We don't have any binding agreements. And I agree that water is fuzzy and it's difficult. I've been working on the contestation of water for a long time and the multiple values, etc. But on the other hand, we can agree on some things. It's outrageous that 2 billion or so many billions lack access to water and sanitation. We can agree on that. We can agree on certain things, I think. And I think that is where we really need more action. Now, what was disappointing for me was, even though we realized that we should have water and sanitation, and everything is interlinked, wastewater, it was mostly about water rather than really looking at all the connections. And I think that was slightly disappointing, that it ended up more being about water, whereas we actually have to look at all the linkages. It was great that climate was mentioned, food was mentioned, but as one of the speakers said, we can only work if the urgency of water is realized across the different sectors. And how do we do that? How do we break out of our silo, the water silo, and actually speak out? So I think I'm kind of missing that. Henk kept saying we don't agree, but who is the we? I want to know who the we is. I mean, nobody agrees on most things. So I'm not clear that really matters. We can agree that there's contestation, that there's going to be multiple perspectives, but there should be some agreement, I think. And the UN also had a lot of there were some of these points that came up around the water envoy. I'm not sure whether that's happening. I'm not sure what's happening. So in terms of follow-up, what do I want to see? I want to know what the follow-up is. Is there going to be more action? Is the UN going to carry on? Is this a one-off event? I mean, this event was largely possible because the Dutch stepped up, but we can't have the Dutch leading water. They can't solve the global water crisis. So, who's at what exactly is to be done? So now the final points. In terms of what we really need, the fragmentation, I think, has to be addressed. So we need to break out of our comfort zones. But similarly, the other sectors also have to realize water. The invisibility of water in the UN has to be broken. I think it's everybody's priority and it's across scales. It's global, it's local, it's regional. So really look at it across. And I think really have a rights accountability regime. I mean, I think that needs to be in place. We really need to be able to hold powerful actors to account. And I think that is seriously lacking at the global level, at the national level, in terms of donors, in terms of the private sector. I agree about the narratives. I think I spoke about that earlier, the fact that some certain narratives were being advanced over others. So that's in a nutshell what I had to say. There were a few things, but I can raise them later because I think you also want audience participation.
For sure. Thanks a lot, Lyla. And I think there are a couple of questions there that perhaps I can address later. I also wanted to make a comment before opening to the general audience here, both in the room and online. And something that, so Henk, I can't agree more with the fact that we need to find a transparent way to organize these agreements. And my understanding about the UN Water Conference was that it was a moment to shape the water action agenda through the commitments. And what I perceived instead was that in many instances, in the rooms that mattered, there was a certain type of agreement that was kind of prevailing. Here at NEWAVE, we work on the notion of paradigms, of hegemonic paradigms. And I wonder how much of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water shaped what was actually the screenplay, what was actually being told as the new narrative for the future of water governance. So my question really there is, how much was the UN Water Conference open to really shape the water action agenda? And how much, and this is a little bit of a provocative question, how much instead we as accredited organizations were there to legitimize something that was already decided, something that, for example, was clearly detailed in the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. So with this question, with this open question, I don't know if it's a question that is possible to answer. I would like to.
It is possible to answer. And it's just quick. Lyla, also on the point that out of the conference is, you know, and we knew this before, there is no agreement. There's also no home for water at the UN. UN Water is a meeting, not an organization. So one of the outcomes is that Secretary General and Guterres and Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed said, one, we will give water a home. They're building a plan and we'll present it before the HLPF. Second, there will be a strengthening of that coordination mechanism with UN Water is. And third, they will appoint a UN envoy on water. So in this triangle, that gives the opportunity for the UN in the context of the political conversation among member states to build this agenda that is absent. There is no agenda. And that really goes to your point on the narrative. There really was no mandate for a narrative. There is no narrative. So don't ask a conference that you don't give a mandate to come up with a narrative. Who dominated the narrative? There was no negotiation. There was voluntary commitments by themselves don't build a narrative. They're merely cries of pain out of society, public and private, small and big, across borders and without crossing borders, what needs to happen. So don't ask something that, well, how would I say this best? Don't ask a tree to become a car or something. I don't know. It's like impossible. So actually, I'm getting closer to the building we are all talking about. Because I have a meeting I need to attend. In that building that is now so challenged. Here, look, here. This is the UN. By all of us. So I think, yes, there is, and rightly so, I think all your questions are right, but we did not give ourselves the opportunity with this conference to answer them all, but we need them to be answered. So it's not a question of if the questions are not right, but the conference was not the mechanism to answer them all. And then if you ask or judge the conference based on the hope that was the place to answer them, then there was definitely then there is a gap too. And of course, we try to do more than we were mandated to. And yes, we did. Did we succeed? I don't know. The other thing I get from the conversation, which I find really empowering, is that all of you say in different words that it should happen. That inclusivity, full transparency, organization across scales. So, and I think that is also something I got from the conference, is that knowing that there's nothing on water, no mandated, organizational capacity, it needs to happen. Yeah. So way too late, 46 years after, without having that. This was the first time where we tried to set a first step. We did not try to bring the solution, but to create the first step into hopefully something that will grow at scale and speed to something that is valuable for all. I hope.
Thank you, Henk, and also thank you for showing us around New York. That's really nice. And I would like to open up the floor to our researchers here in the room. So, Marie, perhaps you would like to briefly say your name.
Can you hear me? Or we can repeat the question.
Hi, my name is Marie Belan. I'm doing research in Indonesia, more precisely in Semarang, which is a city I know Henk knows well, leading a project there. We touched upon the topic of the Dutch water expertise and the Dutch approach to water. And I was wondering whether you think that this is an approach that would need a deep rethinking. The way that I see the Dutch approach in the Netherlands is that it's very much based on trying to control water and trying to keep it separated from land. And so far it's shown to have quite problematic outcomes in terms of damages to the environment and damages to low-income residents, since space for water is also space you need to evict residents from. And therefore I wanted to have the opinion of our panelists about what the Dutch approach to water is bringing to the conversation we're having, and whether it needs to be challenged and redesigned. Thank you very much.
As we have, as time is flying, I would like to ask the panelists to give a very succinct answer. I don't know if would you like to go or not? Okay. Perhaps then this question is actually for you. Yes.
Mhm.
I see also Lyla is happy to chip in.
No, I think Henk is best placed to discuss, but obviously I think it's interesting because there's been, I've been part of a program of work on IWM in Southern Africa, and there was an analysis there about, how a small group of Dutch people, there's few institutions, Wageningen and Delft, shaping the water agenda and really taking those ideas to different contexts, to basins that are far removed, like in Southern Africa, very different. So this, yes, I think, one, obviously there's been amazing work that the Dutch have done around water, but there are these approaches around control and also maybe, the policy diffusion of key ideas. And I'm also interested, while we still have Henk before he goes to his meeting, is how did the Dutch and Tajikistan get to organize this conference? Why Tajikistan? And, how did that come about?
Okay, so I'm happy to try to do both. I don't represent the Netherlands way of dealing with water. I actually, because I come from Netherlands, know there is no Netherlands way of dealing with water. So don't simplify it. We are learning. We set up a learning program for sea level rise because we acknowledge we have no clue if learning German is our best adaptation strategy or investing in nature. Yeah? So I think we try around the world to mimic the French, the Indonesians, the Africa, the Peruvian approaches. It's not helpful. The European continent will be as challenged by all these impacts as I just came off the phone of the Earth Commission researchers, and then the extremes are, we ain't seen nothing yet. So, I mean, there is no, second, every way of dealing with water needs a cultural, geographically connected to place and people and politics for that matter approach. So there is no plane of solutions you can fly over the world and bring salvation. Don't simplify it. I'm not saying you are, I'm just saying some are, and that makes the conversation really complex. It just doesn't work that way. The Netherlands and Tajikistan. Well, Tajikistan is the big UN champion on water. They've been advocating water here at the UN forever. And they, in their region, are sitting on top of the single largest glacier, or actually that glacier compact sits on top of them, you could say, providing freshwater resources to Central Asia. 60% of freshwater resources come from Tajikistan. It's their championship at the UN on the Water Action Decade. And this conference being the midterm review of the Water Action Decade, that there was only a question who would want to do this with Tajikistan. It was not the other way around. And these type of conferences that are always organized by a Global North, Global South partnership. As said, in coming from the high level panel on water 2016, 2018, from 2018 to 2020, we had a conversation among many who will join hands with Tajikistan in negotiating this resolution out, where the modalities of the conference would be sketched and the co-chairs would be named. And we decided this was something we would like to take on because we really thought and still think it is of critical importance that we raise that voice on water. And then to your point on who stole the narrative of the conference, was it the Global Commission? I can't reiterate enough that the narrative out of this conference still has to be built. I totally agree on the fact that game changers are not the way to frame this narrative, but that is the way how the President of the General Assembly tried to frame it. I ask you to listen carefully to the 5 interactive dialogues, 10 co-chairs reporting back. That message is perhaps I'm saying, but I hope and I think, but others can disagree, but that collective message of those 10 co-chairs, informed by those dialogues, informed by the other dialogues, can be the start of building a narrative. But there is no negotiation, so there's also no agreement, and that is very clear. Even if we want this to be, it's not the case. So it can't be judged against it.
Thank you, Henk. I'll pass it to Christina.
Thank you for all the panelists. My question is to Henk. So what's next for the UN Water Conference? If there is no plan or discussion in place yet, why not? Thank you.
But that is, so I'm at the UN now. Member states are also confronted with the fact that after the conference, there's nothing organized. So there's a couple of things happening. One, we want to make sure, but we need the world for that water finds a home in every other follow-up process, SDG Summit, COP, etc. Remember, 1.5 years ago, we had a food system summit. It's not only UN, it's countries, it's cities, it's industry, it's NGOs. So it's everyone, academics, activists, the food system summit, where water is not part. The last COP was the first time water was in a cover text. A cover text is nothing. It's not part of the negotiation, only on adaptation. So we're nowhere close in baking in water in every other UN process. So that's one. Second, follow up on the water action agenda and trying to develop this into a mechanism, an instrument that has that transparency and accountability. We don't know, but as I said, HLPF will be the first proof of the pudding, and the next HLPF actually will be more of a proof, because we're too close now to the conference to really show, but at least we can set the bar and the ambition on if this can be valuable. Third, strengthening the UN organizational, institutional capacity with a home for water, with the Envoy on water, and with a mandated, stronger UN water in the combination. So we will have 3 And fourth, a follow-up process for another conference. I'm not a fan of a range of conferences, but because there is no agreed upon negotiative framework, a next conference can help raise that bar at least, for sure. And perhaps then we can build that narrative with the collective voices that are there. But then we, of course, need 2 member states to volunteer to hold the helm there. And we need, of course, brilliancy on the UN system and leadership from Envoy's role in a combination of global South and North across generation voices to build such a place. That's not going to be easy.
There's thank you, Henk. There is a comment from Lyla, and Lyla, if you can keep it as succinct as possible.
Well, I was struck by the importance given to the report on the Global Commission on Water. I mean, there are so many reports, so I was wondering, and it did have a particular narrative. So I do agree, Jampel, you know, this idea that we need more economics in water as opposed to so many other things. You know, why not anthropology, or why not culture, or why not other things, indigeneity? So I agree with the comments from all of you in the room that there was some narrative being pushed. And it was very much at the global level. And, you know, we need action across. Water is multi-scalar, so we really need to look across the scales. And interesting about that report was that one summary was the one that was really flagged, which was by Rockstrom et al., as opposed to some of the other, the more comprehensive report, which actually had much more meat, but that got zero attention. So again, you know, if you're looking at which hegemonic discourse counts or not, it was interesting.
Are there any other questions in the room?
I have a curiosity, Henk. So I wonder if you think that the different type of stakeholders, let's say private sector, civil society, indigenous groups, had actually the same power to influence the conference. And something that I was left with a little bit of surprise is how come the president of Bayer was invited to share their comments soon after General Secretary in the concluding plenary, considering the, let's say, controversial role that Monsanto has in water extraction.
Yeah, and WEF, also World Economic Forum, Coke was on panels with indigenous people, so I think.
So on the first, it's a UN conference. So it's a member state conference dominated by member states. I think there's a lot of conversation if that is the right way to do it. And if we need a different way of organizing these type of meetings, I'm happy to go in a theoretical discussion there. But there was literally, this was exactly what was given within there are negotiated rules of organizing these conferences that were in place that were not part of the conference negotiation, the conference preparations at all. And it's not an excuse. I think the UN gave us back that we pushed way too far and hard in the context of what they could achieve on this. So we felt the borders and barriers and boundaries of everything we agreed, but it also shows that it's not enough. So I think we need definitely this follow-up conversation on how this works. Then on the closing, it's very interesting to, if you listen back to what really happened, we paused the closing for an informal segment where we invited youth and indigenous and private sector and politicians to the room. And then after that, we opened the conference again. So they are not part of the conference. And the same goes for the opening. The UN has strict rules on this that we follow. So it's a little bit of a weird thing on how do you get a youth, an indigenous representative of the finance sector, and in this case also Bayer in his role of the Water and Climate Coalition. That is why he got invited by the PGA. There are many reasons how to bring in different voices, but it is not part of the formal conference.
Right, I think
the same with the opening where we brought in, hello, my boss, the opening where we brought in the youth from across the world. It's not part of the formal opening. It is a informal session. So the rules of the UN are not part of the negotiation or the preparation for this conference, but are strict.
Thank you so much. So we reached our time.
I really have to go.
Thank you, Henk. It was a huge opportunity. Yeah. Thanks a lot. And thank you, Lyla.
I'm sorry we failed on you. We'll do better next time. Yeah.
No, you didn't fail, but we are here to try to improve the process and provide that space of discussion and debate as NEWAVE. So thank you.
No, you didn't fail. You did a great job. It's just. Oh, are we done?
Anything else? The time is over in theory, but if you don't mind staying a couple of minutes more.
Sure. Yeah, I can stay a few minutes. I think there are some people in the chat, in the Q&A.
Okay, sounds good. So it would be great to.
Maybe Lyla, you want to pick a question from the Q&A chat?
Yeah, I think I think many of them are comments. So I think Khaled talks about the issue of political will. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's not just for low to middle income countries, it's even the global north. I mean, just look at the lack of commitment to some of these global challenges from European countries, as we've seen in recent years. Mosa and I agree. I also asked Henk that question about why is it that states could not come up with a global agreement. I think, I mean, I wanted to know what exactly was saying. I think it takes a long time. And for me, the intriguing thing is that I just don't understand why water has been, I guess it's so invisible in the UN system, even in terms of human rights. So, food was acknowledged as a human right in 1948, and in water, it was such a battle. And it was just acknowledged in 2010. So I think we really, and, even the general agreement, which defined the scope of water, was then narrowed down so drastically in the final human rights. So I think there's some issue about lack of global urgency around water. And maybe it's because it's so invisible, because it's women, children are the ones worst affected. I don't know. And I think, that there is something there. And I hope things will change moving forward. And finally, how can global water governance be a solution? Climate, biodiversity all show lack of will on global action. Why do we want to believe water will be different? I don't think water will be different, but I think at least there is more of a global governance, more global actors on water and food that we don't see in water. And I think that was raised in this panel. And it would be great to see. It doesn't mean the problems will be solved. There'll still be issues. And I think in terms of social movements too, the food movement has been very united. Viva Campesina and others. We just don't have that kind of global movement in water. Maybe because of the nature of water. It's slippery, it's variable across time and space. And finally, Nubert says that the Netherlands experience is a plus. It has been for decades, but we can expand. So hopefully some of these discussions can take place in the Africa region. So everybody has a voice. Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be opened up. And I think even though Henk said that the final session had all these amazing conclusions from the stakeholder dialogue, I also thought that to some extent, yes, they were diverse, but there was still it could have been more diversity in the voices and even the approaches, and they were also portraying a certain narrative. So, you know, if it were in a different location, you might see it differently.
Briefly, because I'm sure you will deserve the drink or two and dinner, but I just want to make one point that's always icking me a bit. Do we really think that we need a global agreement for water? And do we think that if we had a global agreement for water, that would solve our problems? Because what would be, you know, very pragmatically, what would be in that agreement? I mean, there's just so many things. Is it about wash? Is it about access? Is it about hygiene? Is it about newly emerging pollutants? Is it about water resources management? Is it about gender dynamics? And will we ever realistically be able to put that in an agreement? And would that agreement have any legal and political power? That's for me, the first question. Secondly, don't we already have instruments that we should actually be using more, right? Shouldn't we move ahead the human rights to water agenda? Shouldn't we be moving ahead the 1997 UN Water Courses Convention? Shouldn't we be moving ahead the draft articles on transboundary aquifers? And on top of that, is these things that, as I said earlier, need to be governed at the global level, or shouldn't we see how at the national level, the many still problematic international or national water laws, policies, how we can work with them? Shouldn't we see how we deal with the more than 600 transboundary water treaties that we have and make sure that they get implemented and really improve the state of water resources in the basins that the people and the environment ultimately depend on? And that sort of combined with the fact that I don't think we'll get to a global agreement, certainly not in my lifetime, and probably also not 3 other lifetimes. I think it's a question where we focus our efforts. So I wouldn't put my efforts into a global agreement.
Hello everyone, I'm Adnan. I work on political ecology of irrigation water in Kurdistan and Turkey. And actually I was listening the whole discussion as a farmer and as a researcher, because I'm coming from a farming family, from a smallholder farming family, and still my family's livelihood all depend on the water. If there is not enough water, they cannot survive, they cannot continue farming. And the thing that I think we should just reflect on, if the things that we are doing, if it is not considered, our ideas, the research, the all things that we are doing, if they are not considered, if the state members, the UN Water Conference and other these big conferences, if they don't care about our ideas, we shouldn't spend our limited time and resources to try to convince them and try to do something with them. No, we should stop. We should stop doing it because we have limited resources. And yeah, academia is very privileged, is very something which I'm also grateful to have this chance coming from a working class farming family to finish the PhD. But I am thinking, reflecting also what I have done until now and what I want to do from now. And I think we have very nice examples like MST, Brazilian landless movement and landless workers movement, how they just say, okay, if the state, it doesn't work, we should create our own alternative ways of doing things. And then we can contribute to these alternatives without thinking, oh, how we can convince policymakers to do some change. No, if we want to be a part of the change, we can just focus on who is suffering most from the water issues. And farmers, yeah, are one of the examples which I know from myself, from my family. And we should give up the idea. That's true. I'm discussing with some of my colleagues to prepare a manifesto, also for academicians, especially for these world-known professors. There should be a manifesto that's some ethical values that we should have. And each professor, each researcher who signed this manifesto, that we know that who is ethical, who wants to contribute to this change in a radical way, in a more grassroots way, not from going to make to how we can create a research question and get more funding. It's not about it. It's really about to touch people's lives on the ground, who is suffering most. Thank you.
Maybe just a quick comment from me, Adnan. You're absolutely right. And at the same time, I think a challenge as complex as water will need the interventions at all levels. So you're absolutely right that perhaps from your perspective and your lens, and maybe as researchers from ours, a certain focus on like creating the alternative is so important to put energy into. But somebody also has to taking care of, at the policy level, both from like municipal to local, national, regional, and global. And so perhaps I think, it was a very interesting discussion around where do we put our energy? Maybe, it's not going to be solved at the global level, but there has to be some degree of addressing that and also tackling it at all the different levels. And so I hope that in all of our like different approaches, ultimately something will culminate.
And I think it has to be addressed at the global level, not in the form of an agreement as a binding, negotiated agreement that the countries sign up to. Just to make
clearly, there are many necessary conversations to have, debates, and as Henk said, and I agree with him, find ways to organize transparently and put forward what type of disagreements there are so that we can actually understand then which positions are prevailing and which are not. On this note, I think it's time for us to move in the next room for some water and refreshers and drinks. And I want to thank so much Lyla for being with us. It's a pity that we're not physically here, but it was great to have you. And thank you for all of our participants online. So thank you, and see you at our next NEWAVE study.
Thank you very much.